Let me ask you something. Is this post wrong? I admit my first reaction to this statement is defensive. After all, Elden Ring is one of my favorite games ever. But as someone who also has criticisms of Elden Ring that few fans would ever levy, I hate illusory walls, I think the new player experience is crap, and I think the quest design is crap, to name three, it would be intellectually lazy of me not to consider whether this charge against the game has merit. And yes, it is referring to Elden Ring. No, you can't see the context of the thread because this was the only noteworthy post, which is why I saved it. But if you'll take my word for it, the thread was indeed about Elden Ring, if the 7 didn't clue you in. The player's options for mitigating damage come down to two categories, from which you must choose when facing the many bosses and their many attacks and styles of attacks that the game puts in front of you. Those being direct, moves that in themselves mitigate an enemy attack, and indirect, moves that prevent the enemy from attacking in the first place. Tanking damage simply isn't an option most of the time in Elden Ring due to its high lethality, and is only really a viable tactic if one is over-leveled for a particular fight. Now, that isn't actually hard to do for many parts of the game, but I consider that a separate issue, an inevitable consequence of an open-world RPG with no level scaling, and hence, it's not really an issue at all. Now, barring that caveat, it's irrelevant to the late game anyway. You simply take too much damage and are too easily knocked around for your stock of flasks to really compensate. As regards indirect mitigation, one method is a sneak attack, wherein you avoid even giving the enemy the chance to attack you in the first place. However, these can generally only be used in the overworld, since dungeons tend to be designed to funnel you into fights, and usually only against trash mobs, not bosses. There are certain bosses that can be, but even then, they always have enough health that unless they're vulnerable to some kind of cheese, like poison misting the Draconic Tree Sentinel to death, your surprise attack will not kill them, and they will have the opportunity to attack you themselves. The other, and actually very effective indirect method, is to embrace the old maxim that the best defense is a good offense. You use a build that can either constantly stance break or stun lock a boss, preventing them from ever getting an attack off. Not all bosses are vulnerable to this, so it's not a universally usable tactic, but many of them are, and it can trivialize fighting them. It does, however, lock you into using specific builds that can do this, such as a nuke wizard spell that uses Comet Azur and or Meteorite of Astel, or a strength Grug build that uses jumping attacks with high poise damage weapons, right? The, double giant crusher meme thing, right? So this is absolutely a valid alternative to roll spam, much of the time. However, you are forced to use a build slash play style that enables it. If you want to fight in some other manner, or if you're fighting an enemy you can't lock down, you will need to rely on something else to avoid damage. On that note, direct damage mitigation. Sometimes you can, in fact, just move out of the way. But this isn't doable in many circumstances because most enemies have no problem pivoting and redirecting the direction of their attacks as the animation plays. There are some that can, particularly big, well-telegraphed ones, but they're not common. And some are so big that running won't save you anyway. The fact your character can't turn and sprint on a dime, right? They require a bit of time to accelerate, doesn't help. Certain attacks can be jumped over, but only certain ones. And the mechanic is used entirely to avoid ground-based damage, i.e. by jumping vertically. There's no function for your character to leap in a particular direction using jumping. Its use is basically entirely vertical. You can only leap by sprinting before jumping, which locks you into committing to a direction for a duration since you need sufficient run-up to cause it. thus relegating it to a platforming mechanic, not a combat one. You can use Quick Step as a lateral dodge move, of course, but it's not a default move your character can perform. You must assign it as a weapon skill to perform it, thus giving up other options. Parrying is another option, and is quite effective due to it opening enemies up for retaliation. But not all attacks can be parried, and this gets increasingly evident as bosses grow in size and power, and further, figuring out which attacks can and can't be parried, given how exact the timing can be, even for a parryable attack, is an exercise in trial and error, and it's perfectly fair to not want to go through that just to learn how to parry every enemy that can be parried. Epic style, when you could choose something far easier to use that just works every time. Before I get to that, however, a word about our old friend blocking. Some find it boring. Fair enough. But there are a lot of attacks in Elden Ring that can be blocked, even big ones you might assume can't, most famously Waterfowl. Of course, that runs into the same problem that parrying does, of figuring out what can and can't be blocked being trial and error, but at least it takes less effort than parrying, since it's obviously way easier to hold the block button than to learn parry windows. However, the simplicity comes with a downside. You are, in fact, penalized even for a successful block, since you take stance damage on every hit, a value that the game does not show you, for reasons I'm sure Michael Zaki's fan club will insist is secretly genius somehow. This makes it unclear at any given moment whether you can actually continue to block without getting stance broken. You're forced into guesswork. This means that if the enemy attacks powerfully and or quickly enough, you cannot rely solely on blocking because you will get stance broken. You must use some other method while you wait for your invisible stance meter to refill. Further, there are, of course, large, powerful attacks you simply cannot block. Again, you must use some other method to avoid these, unless you use Vow of the Indomitable. But that requires going all in, since you can only use one Ash of War at a time. Relying on Vow of the Indomitable is, thus, a perfectly valid tactic, and you can even try to make up for the lack of a weapon skill with weapon buffs, but there's a lot of really useful weapon ashes you've got to sacrifice when playing this way, and naturally, why do that unless you're aesthetically into the whole unbreakable wall thing, in which case, fair enough. When you can get your iframes and use other Ashes of War. Same applies to Bloodhound Step, which is, in effect, a super dodge roll, and is most famous for being the seemingly intended counter to Waterfowl Dance. But it has the same problem as Quick Step and Vow. It's an Ash of War. It's not a universal ability. Thus, we come to the almighty dodge roll. The reason this is the go-to, most used method of damage mitigation is simple. Guaranteed iframes, no matter your build. Nothing else in the game that's relevant anyway. There's scenarios where you can exploit the iframes from mounting and dismounting Torrent to avoid damage, for instance, but obviously that's a niche case. Gives you these. It is, therefore, the only move any character build can do that will avoid damage from even ridiculous fuck-huge attacks where your rolling model just clips right through the enemy and or their weapon as if it weren't there. The only thing you have to learn is timing, just like parrying. But unlike parrying, almost every attack in the game can be rolled. The few that can't are either dodged by jumping, are scripted to damage you no matter what, like Mohg's Nihil, or just busted horseshit like Waterfowl, which is a separate issue. Some enemies have attacks that directly punish incorrect roll timing, like Morgott's infamous dagger, or delay their attack animations to force you to learn the exact timing, but much of the time you aren't penalized at all. As long as you learn the timings, the only trick to rolling is to learn the few attacks that can't be rolled and jump over them. Otherwise, it's iframes all day, baby. Easy to use, little to no penalty for using it, vastly more reliable, especially for fights you're new to, than almost any other method, and it doesn't take up your L2. It's no wonder the dodge roll is the default go-to move for avoiding damage, especially since, as I said, there's many attacks which can only be iframed through. Hence, it's little wonder much of Elden Ring's combat can end up boiling down to a sort of rhythm game based around dodge rolls, where you learn the timing on enemy attacks until you can reliably dodge them, attacking in between when the boss isn't doing chained anime acrobatics all over the fucking arena, of course, which, especially if you're using something one note like a pure strength bonk build, as many FromSoft fans do, becomes mechanically repetitive and starts leaning harder on spectacle to hold it up. Now, I would argue the spectacle saves it. More than saves it, really. It's one of the main reasons the game is one of the greatest ever made. But I will not deny the pull the game's mechanics have towards encouraging monotonous dodge roll spam, the originally mentioned roll slop. You'll note that even though there are multiple other ways of avoiding damage, and some are useful in situations where others are not, thus appearing to encourage variety, they all have downsides. They all have drawbacks that either prevent them from being used all the time or require some kind of sacrifice to use, most evident with rolling's primary competitor, Vow of the Indomitable. You get a block equivalent of the dodge roll, but because it's a move tied to a shield, not an inherent ability every character can perform, you have to equip a shield and give up all other Ashes of War to make it your universal block, unless you learn the timing so well that you can reliably switch between a Vow-equipped shield and your weapon of choice with your Ash of choice to get use of both, which is certainly possible, but takes way more effort than just pressing circle. No such sacrifice or inordinate effort is needed to roll. Every character can roll, all the time, so long as you have any stamina. Nothing must be given up to do it, and it gives the same iframe graces as Vow. Same with stun locking enemies. It works, but you have to use a build that can do it, thus preventing you from using any build that can't, i.e. most of them. The dodge roll allows any character to get those sweet, sweet iframes while still using any build, any weapon, any skills they want. The downsides simply aren't there to discourage falling back on rolling. So no, actually, Anon wasn't wrong. Elden Ring does, in fact, encourage dodge roll spam, and it can, certainly, become mechanically monotonous. And if you're someone who likes mechanical complexity, I can see how this could be offensive to your preferences. I, however, would argue it is largely inconsequential in the grand scheme of the game. Not just because a lot of people actually like the roll spam plus punish window rhythm style of gameplay. I'm not particularly attached to it myself, for what it's worth, but because the spectacle of what I'm doing can more than make up for any mechanical simplicity. And it must be noted, there are plenty of games that ask you to execute a fairly repetitive mechanical loop, yet people will do it gladly if it's consistently engaging. So to take Elden Ring in particular to task for it seems odd, especially given how many people evidently enjoy it. None of that is to say I would not encourage From to enhance the player's arsenal of useful defensive moves, either by adding new ones, leaps, sidesteps, etc., or by buffing existing ones, only that I don't consider it a huge deal. But I understand why someone might.